Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. For the past few episodes, I've been talking about sort of ghost stories set in Astoria, New York, which is where I live. It's a neighborhood in Western Queens. And kind of as I've been doing all this research in historical newspaper databases and such, I have found some ghost stories about other neighborhoods in Queens, on Long Island, and in Brooklyn. I don't know how many of these other neighborhoods I'm going to talk about, but I was going to talk about some interesting ghost stories from Long Island City near Calvary Cemetery, which is, Long Island City is a neighboring neighborhood to Astoria. But I got so into this other article I found about another neighboring neighborhood called Woodside, which is a neighborhood that I used to live in. I got so into that story from Woodside, and I really went down a rabbit hole. And so I want to talk about this, probably for this episode, and it'll probably seep into the next episode. This will probably be a two-parter. And then after that, I have a lot of interesting stories about other parts of Western Queens, like Long Island City. So this story harkens back sort of to an early episode of this podcast. I want to say it was the third episode of this podcast. I talked about the phenomenon of playing the ghost in Australia. This was a 19th century phenomenon, and the articles that I was reading and that I found focus mostly on this phenomenon popping up in Victoria, which is a state, province, I can't remember what they call it, but basically like a state in Australia. It's where Melbourne is. And what was happening is people were dressing up like ghosts and then running around and scaring people. They were even going as far as painting themselves with glow-in-the-dark, like phosphorescent paint that was literally toxic, and running around in this glowing paint in, dresses painted to glow in old bed sheets. A lot of the people who were doing it seemed like sex pests, like men who wanted to bother women. And so there was some unpleasantness with some of those stories. But also there were just random people doing random things. Like, if I'm remembering right, there was a story about a woman who wore, I want to say, a wedding dress painted with phosphorescent paint. And she was like on a rooftop playing guitar. It was really weird. And there were stories about people going out to like try to shoot these ghosts or people pretending to be ghosts. And this story in Australia was pretty straightforward. It was kind of like ghost hoaxing in Australia. It wasn't really a question of whether some of these ghosts could be real. All the newspaper articles, all the accounts of it were just like, no, these aren't real ghosts. These are just people pretending. Don't know why they're doing that. And, there was stuff to be said for like Victorian social norms and sort of wanting to have this permission to act strangely in a time that was pretty repressive and had a lot of rules about what you had to be like, etc. So if you want to know more about that, it's a very early episode of this podcast. And I do think that playing the ghost was a bit of a thing in London as well. If I'm remembering right, even in, I think, the 1700s, there were groups of youths going around dressing up like ghosts and stuff and causing havoc, kind of like young nobility behaving badly. And, there's stories in England of characters like Spring-Heeled Jack, where maybe there was something paranormal going on, who knows? Spring-Heeled Jack was sort of a urban legend that terrified a lot of people, and he was sort of this devilish character who would appear in 19th century London and scare people. So I know this is a lot of lead up to talk about what this story is, but the headline of the article that turned me on to this Woodside Ghost story is "Hunting for a Ghost. Long Island villagers turn out with shotguns. A gaunt sheeted specter scene. This particular goblin haunted an old spring where it scared children. If the ghost is caught, he will get a coat of tar and feathers." Headlines were really long back in the 19th century. So this is an article that I found in the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I assume it was a reprint from an article that was published in New York, but this is where I found this article. And this is from Friday, July 28th, 1893. I did find one more article about this topic from the same day that I'll talk about later, but it wasn't super widely reported as far as I could tell. But the story that it sets forth is that a group of people who were living in Woodside, which, like I said, is a neighborhood near Astoria that I used to live in, this group of people set off to look for a ghost who had been hanging around the old town spring and scaring children and chasing women and girls. So, like I said, that was very similar to stories about people playing the ghost in late 19th century Australia. Women and children tended to be targeted in those instances, or at least women. As soon as I said that, I was like, wait, I can't actually remember if children were targeted, but women definitely were. And, like I said, a lot of these men were sort of sex pests. So that was interesting to me. I was like, okay, this idea that you can, try to shoot a ghost or tar and feather a ghost, at least from the headline, it kind of feels like this is not something that people think is paranormal. So I was initially reading this article and I was kind of like, this will be just a quick thing I can touch on and then move on, which are always famous last words for me. So, like I said, this entity was seen around a spring in the woods in Woodside. So this was near Betts Avenue and Greenpoint Avenue, which, according to Forgotten New York, which is a great website with all sorts of interesting history and research about New York City on kind of a street-by-street level, Betts Avenue is now 58th Street, and Greenpoint Avenue is now Roosevelt Avenue. However, it is worth mentioning that there is still a Greenpoint Avenue in this area that's near Calvary Cemetery, and then that leads to Greenpoint in Brooklyn. It goes over a bridge. But it sounds like the woods and the spring that we're talking about here are at 58th and Roosevelt in today's world. So to read from this article, this old spring dates back beyond the recollection of the oldest inhabitants, and it is said that it never runs dry. It is the center of a network of paths that lead in from the avenues. The brush around it is taller than a man's head. During the recent drought, more than half the village of Woodside has obtained water from the spring. All day long, until late at night, groups of children, girls, and women could be seen in all directions with pails in their hands going to and fro from the spring. So it was an old spring, but it was also very much in use. However, worth noting the fact that the article said that people were using the spring because of the drought. So it almost sounds like maybe it wasn't used as often, and then there was a drought, and now suddenly it's being used a lot, and there's this entity that people are encountering. So a few days before this article was written, a group of kids went to the spring and were scared away by this entity. And then the next day, the same thing happened a few times, and eventually the children were so frightened that they didn't even want to go back to the spring to get their pails, which they had dropped in fright. Also, a group of women went to the spring and were scared away. So, maybe because of this drought, there were more people coming and going to the spring. And here's the description of what apparently happened to all these different people. Oh, and before I read this, I guess I should give a quick content warning. If you're someone who doesn't want to hear about someone like sneaking up on people, especially women, and scaring them, maybe don't listen to this. There's nothing graphic here, and it's not even that scary. But I do know that some people struggle hearing descriptions of like people sneaking up on women and frightening them. So if that's you, maybe this isn't the episode for you. Anyway, so let me read from this article about what people were encountering. While bending over drawing water, they were stealthily approached from behind by a tall, gaunt individual, dressed entirely in white, who suddenly sprang upon them. The children said he got down on all fours and crawled after them like a ravenous animal. He chased 14-year-old Annie Robinson, whose father keeps a grocery store in Greenpoint Avenue, more than a mile before she escaped. So, worth pausing here. That's so creepy. The idea that this entity dressed all in white pops out of the woods, which has, brush as high as a person's head, and then comes crawling towards you on all fours and is able to chase you for a mile on all fours while you're running. That's pretty freaky. The article goes on to list a bunch of different people who saw the entity by name. So, sometimes in ghost stories, you get one witness, or maybe a single witness who isn't that reliable, or maybe a single witness or two who aren't named. And in this article, it does give the names of specific people who seem to be like upstanding members of society. They're willing to go on the record about this freaky thing that happened. So the article talks about one man who saw this entity and he chased after him. In general, it was women and children who this entity was chasing after. But in this case, a man sees him and he's like, that's that person or thing that's been terrorizing people. I'm going to go after him. However, according to the article, he was not fleet-footed enough, and in the dense woods, he lost the trail. A search was made by some of the men that night. They discovered a sort of bed and shelter constructed deep in the woods, which was thought to be the rendezvous of the person they were hunting. A watch was left at the place, but no one came. Later, one man from the neighborhood was walking home around midnight and saw, quote, a figure sheeted like a ghost float out of the clump of brush and cut fantastic capers in the road, moving about as silently as a shadow. The man's heart came up in his throat. He says he didn't make any outcry, but every now and then the ghostly dancer would give utterance to an unearthly shriek that caused his hair to stand on end and made the cold sweat trickle down his back. Then the dogs began to bark, and persons disturbed by the shrieks came to their doors, and the phantom turned a few handsprings and disappeared as suddenly as he came. So a couple interesting things here, right? Talks about this entity dancing around, then doing a handspring, which is, acrobatics. That's a little bit unusual. Makes me think a little bit of Spring-Heeled Jack, which was, a figure who was known for jumping around a lot, right? Spring-Heeled Jack, that's where the name comes from. And then also the unearthly shriek was interesting to me too in reading this section. Of course, a human person can shriek as well. It doesn't have to be something paranormal, but that was something that flagged to me as something interesting. And ditto with the acrobatics. There's plenty of people who know how to do handsprings. However, I don't really feel like that's the most common thing that people know how to do. I certainly cannot do handsprings, and I doubt that it was a more common skill in the 19th century in a rural farming area like Woodside. So then the article says that the residents of Woodside were determined to hunt down this person or entity because they wouldn't feel safe otherwise. The idea was that they were going to shoot him or coat him with tar and feathers and beat him, like the headline said. There's that other article that I mentioned that was headlined, "This Ghost is an Acrobat." And this one was published in the Evening World, which is a New York paper, or was a New York paper. It was in the July 28th, 1893 edition, just like the other article was. And it's about the Woodside Ghost, and it calls it the Ghosts of the Spring. Of course, referring to the spring, like the water source it was associated with, but it does make me think, again, of Spring-Heeled Jack. It quotes people from the neighborhood as saying, "Our ghost turns handsprings and cartwheels, and it is very long and slender and white, and it makes no noise among the brittle sticks in the woods, except that it screeches with a blood-chilling, unearthly, piercing yell that makes our knees shake and our hair stand up." So it also talks about, the ghost chasing the 14-year-old girl on all fours, and talks about how, this entity was almost as fast on all fours as a 14-year-old girl was running, using her feet normally, which is just a little weird, right? Like, think about how quickly a person can crawl through the woods compared to like a 14-year-old running at full speed. A little bit unusual. This article also talks about the man who chased him, and it says that when the ghost screeched while it was running away, the sound momentarily paralyzed the man's legs so that he was no longer able to chase the entity, and then this person or creature disappeared into the woods. Now, maybe his getting rooted in place was just because of fear. But is it possible, maybe, that something else was going on there, something paranormal? Like, was there something about this sound that caused him to stop, like casting a spell or just doing something paranormal to make this person freeze so that this entity could get away? Seems possible. I don't know. Like I said, I couldn't find other articles about this story, though I am saying that with the caveat that I guess sometime within the last few days, my New York Public Library card expired, which means that I can't access all the different newspaper databases that I usually search. So I searched the Library of Congress newspaper archives, which aren't as extensive as all the archives I usually search through the New York Public Library. But, the Library of Congress will have to do until I can next go to Manhattan to renew my card in person, because here in Queens we have a different library system. And apparently the New York Public Library doesn't send you an email about your library card expiring every 3 years. It just expires it and then kicks you out of newspaper databases when you need them. Thanks, New York Public Library. So anyway, maybe there are other articles about this entity, but I sort of doubt that there are that many others. I hadn't searched specifically Woodside Ghost or Woodside Haunting in my initial search when I first found this article, but I had searched a bunch of different terms like Queens Ghost, Astoria Ghost, Long Island Ghost, etc. And I think this came up in the Long Island Ghost searches. And I think most articles I would have found relating to this story would have said something about Long Island Ghost. So, because geographically Queens is on Long Island, but especially back at the time, you would have said like Woodside on Long Island, not like Woodside in Queens, just because of how people talked about geography back then. So anyway, a couple things in this story. First, it's possible that this is the story of an unhomed person who took up residence in the woods. I know that's probably the most likely explanation, especially because the searchers found where this person was supposedly living, even if this person disappeared into the woods and didn't come back while they were staking out that location. But there's some weird stuff in this story too, and some aspects of the story that make me think it's fairly possible that it could have been something supernatural. For example, first question, why would a random unhomed person be dressed all in white? That doesn't seem like the most practical color for a person who lives in the woods to be wearing, especially if he's crawling around and doing handsprings and cartwheels and stuff. And if this person was wearing white, he would probably be covered in mud at this point. And if he was covered in mud, I kind of feel like the articles may have mentioned that the man's clothing was filthy or something similar. These 19th century articles tend to be really sensational and tend to really over-describe things. See the last episode that I did about that house that was investigated by Carrington in Astoria, where it was describing this woman's creepy house, etc. And it was just describing a normal house that was maybe a little bit old or something. And it really, really went to town. And I just feel like, and I know that was the 1930s, not the late 19th century, but the 19th century was very guilty of this embellishing as well. It just seems weird that it would say this person was wearing white. And if this person wasn't covered in mud or filthy, then I guess that's why they wouldn't say this person was filthy. But I feel like if this person was covered in mud, it would have had a whole thing about this person's like disheveled appearance and they're filthy and etc., etc. And just in general, like if you're someone who has no home and you presumably just have the clothes on your back, why would the clothes you were wearing be all white? Like if you're already poor, I sort of doubt that all your clothes would be white. But just in general, like I don't think it was normal. Like it's not normal now for people to wear all white all the time, but especially back then, people had so few clothes. I just don't think that someone would have like white trousers and a white shirt and a white jacket or whatever and just be wearing that all the time. So that's weird to me. And then also, like I said, why would this person be doing handsprings? Why would this person know gymnastics? That's a difficult move for anyone but a gymnast to be doing. You know, a handspring. I certainly can't do that. I can't even do a cartwheel. And, you know, I do yoga and stuff, but that's just not like a normal common skill, I think. And part of me wonders if this is a real human person. Could this person be someone who maybe worked at the circus? Or maybe did some sort of vaudeville or something? At first I was thinking, when I first found just the one article, I was like, maybe this person who wrote this article is exaggerating. But then when I found the second article and it went on and mentioned in the headline that this ghost was an acrobat, and it mentioned specifically the townspeople describing this person's acrobatics and had a quote, then I was kind of like, I don't think this is just one writer embellishing. It seems like there's something here, but that just wearing all white, doing acrobatics is a really weird thing to do, especially if you're someone who's crawling around on the ground instead of running after people, right? You're chasing someone and your mode of transport, your mode of running, whatever, to chase someone is running on all fours like an animal. But then you get up and you do a handspring or a cartwheel, you're clearly a very coordinated person. So why wouldn't you just run after someone if you're that athletic and coordinated? That doesn't check out to me. It seems like a really weird detail. And, it's maybe a long stretch to try to claim that this person was actually some sort of supernatural entity. But there were some things about this story that sort of lit up some paranormal related light bulbs in my mind that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So one interesting thing is that, like I mentioned, this wood was near present-day 58th Street and Roosevelt Avenue. There is a church nowadays called St. Sebastian Roman Catholic Church, and that's at Roosevelt Avenue and 58th Street, and the church's rectory is a block or so away from there. So I did some Googling, just looking for Woodside Ghosts and Woodside Hauntings online, and I found very little, almost nothing. However, on ghostsofamerica.com, I found a few people saying things about hauntings in Woodside. And these are obviously just random people on the internet, and this is just a random commenter at ghostsofamerica.com. But this person recounts a story that happened there. And I wanted to read it just because the odds of them talking about something so nearby where this wood supposedly was, when there's so few other stories, just seemed a little weird to me. So let me read you that comment. Does anybody know any history background on the field that is near the St. Sebastian Rectory on 57th Street? There used to be a house, but now it's just an open field. Many years ago, my sister and I were passing by and we saw a girl standing there. She had a blank stare on her face. She was really pale with long black hair, and her dress looked like it was from the 1800s. She was there for a second, and then she disappeared. So that's just a little bit weird because this rectory is very close to where this wood supposedly was. And there wasn't anyone who commented to say anything about the history of the spot, like the location of that field, but one commenter said, "Say what you will, but I live on 58th and I have had a ghost. This ghost has an obsession with ornaments. Every time I come home from work, I find ornaments rearranged. It's like this ghost just wants me to know he or she is there. I have been trying to figure out if the ghost is trying to tell me something. Is there a way to communicate with this entity? Is there a way I can do this on my own, or should I get a hold of an expert? Are there any ghost experts in this area? I'll be checking this site for a reply. Thanks." So, again, these are random people on the internet. But on that website, there were no other accounts of hauntings in Woodside, just those two. However, there was a link to ufosentinel.com, which has one story from Woodside, which was an October 2014 UFO sighting. So that entry reads, "I have lived here in Woodside on 61st Street since 2000, and I have never witnessed anything like I did in October last year. I was with a brother and our dog Jenny. As we were near a church, Jenny stopped frozen for about a minute. Then she started to run around my brother like crazy. Then she stopped and stared at these 4 balls of light. They were flashing yellow and blue and were flying or actually hovering on top of the empty field right by the church. They were looping around the field for almost 5 minutes. My brother and I and Jenny were in shock. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have our phone with us, otherwise we would have taken some pictures to prove that these lights were there for real." So this story leaves a lot of questions hanging. One, while the person lives on 61st Street, what street was this empty field on? Could it have been the field by St. Sebastian's Rectory? Could the person have mistaken the rectory for a church? If this is a young person especially, they may not know the difference between a rectory and a church. And I feel like if you just saw some religious building that said St. Sebastian's, you would maybe kind of for shorthand be like, oh, it's a field near the church. I couldn't remember churches near fields in Woodside, since there aren't many empty fields in Woodside or New York City in general, but I did a Google Map search of churches in Woodside, and I wasn't seeing other church buildings near empty fields. So it seems to me like it probably was the field by the rectory of St. Sebastian's Church on 51st Street off of Roosevelt Avenue. I feel like I should pause here to mention one weird thing. I don't even know if you can call it a synchronicity, but so I lived in Woodside for 4 years, and I've been talking, about 58th Street and 57th Street, right? That's where these hauntings potentially were. That's where this wood with this spring and this entity or unhomed person or whatever, that's where that was located. 58th Street, Roosevelt Avenue. So when I lived in Woodside for 4 years, I lived on 58th Street. Not close, really, to where all this happened, but I just thought it was so weird that this happened. Like, the only hauntings that occurred in Woodside happened on my old street. Or the only hauntings, at least, that were documented that I was seeing. It's just a weird coincidence, and I lived in Woodside for years. I saw a lot of really weird stuff, because in Queens, especially somewhere like Woodside, you'll just see weird things. But I can't think of actual paranormal things that happened. I mean, it's possible that I saw some weird stuff and just kind of wrote it off or forgot about it because that was a very long time ago that I lived there. But it was just a little bit strange to me that out of all the streets in this whole neighborhood, it had to be the one I used to live on, and then of course the street next to the street I used to live on. Just a little weird. So to get back to the stuff I was looking into about these potential hauntings in Woodside, I didn't really have much to work with here. So I did look up St. Sebastian, like the actual saint, to see if he had any relevant associations. The answer is not really. He's a pretty famous saint. And like when I think of St. Sebastian, I think of all the depictions of him, tied to a tree and shot full of arrows. He's usually depicted as like a very young man who's very kind of like angelic looking and is just like full of arrows and covered in blood. However, there is one interesting thing that I saw online that had to do with St. Sebastian, and that, again, this is not directly tied to this story about this ghost or whatever by this spring in Woodside in the 19th century, but it just flagged to me as something that was worth noticing. So I found an article in the Hartford Courant from 1997, and this article told the story of the Sicilian population of Middletown, Connecticut. And the population there is mostly from a town in Sicily that has a real strong devotion to St. Sebastian. And this town has this custom tied to wearing white when honoring St. Sebastian. So here's what the article says about that tradition kind of getting transposed or transported over to Connecticut. Hundreds of men and women dressed in white, called I nudi, or the nude, for their bare or sock-covered feet, run through downtown Middletown before the Sunday Mass to thank and honor St. Sebastian for answering their prayers. So I mentioned this detail because I like to point out coincidences, and maybe if I'm not seeing something, someone else will see something. But I thought that the parallel between the white clothes of the entity seen in 1893, near the site of St. Sebastian's Church, and then, the present day devotees of St. Sebastian wearing white and walking around barefoot, I just thought that was interesting. The barefoot aspect especially interests me because that's a very sort of back to nature, hippie sort of thing to do, which, if we're talking about states that are very not hippie, Connecticut would fit into that category. Connecticut is very straight-laced, and obviously There's all sorts of people, all sorts of places, but Connecticut is very famous for being kind of like a stuffy state where rich stockbrokers live. That's kind of the vibe there. And I've spent a decent amount of time in Connecticut, and much of that time has been at people's beach houses, and even at the beaches in Connecticut, it's just like rich people being rich people. It's not really like barefoot, carefree people. So very strange that people in Connecticut are running around barefoot, wearing all white, etc. I get that it's a religious devotion, but just somewhere as staid and traditional as Connecticut just seems weird to me. And, being barefoot is so, sort of back to nature, whatever, that it also made me think about this entity in the woods. And I was wondering, was he barefoot? And just, there was this weird connection to me between like people in this kind of ecstatic veneration, running around in white, barefoot, to honor St. Sebastian. And then at this place where St. Sebastian's church is now, there was this person living in the woods, behaving very strangely, wearing white, etc. So, all that being said, there's probably no connection between these two things, aside from the idea that some people wear all white for religious reasons. So, that does feel like one possibility why a person might run off into the woods and live alone and dress all in white. Like, could it be a religious thing? Maybe. I don't really think so. Like, what is this, like, acrobat who doesn't seem to communicate in regular English, at least, like, doesn't seem to communicate in words that people nearby can understand, just communicating in sort of these guttural and like almost primal sounds that are like bone chilling, but don't seem to have meaning to people aside from just being scary. And, this person's doing cartwheels and stuff. That just doesn't seem like someone who's like going off into the woods to be like a hermit. But, it could be a reason why someone might decide to live in the woods. I guess like religion could be a reason, but still doesn't feel quite right to me. Also, in case you're wondering, St. Sebastian's Church in Woodside was founded in 1894. So that's the year after these articles about this entity in the woods were written, right? Those articles came out in 1893. The church was founded in 1894. So that's like a weird coincidence as well. However, St. Sebastian's has only been in its current building since 1952. It was apparently the Lowe's Woodside Theater before, but now, then it was purchased and then converted into a church. So, I don't know. Maybe there's something going on in this location, right? Like this little pocket of Woodside. Maybe there's something going on there. The UFO sighting, the only reported ghost stories that I was able to find online about Woodside, this entity in the woods in the 19th century, kind of feels like something's going on there. And it all kind of feels centered around that area near St. Sebastian's Church. So I really went off the deep end a little bit in my analysis of this story and like sort of the places I ended up going to try to explore this idea of like, okay, what's going on in Woodside? What was going on in this place in the 19th century? What things and like stories and archetypes and other weird paranormal stuff could this sighting be tied to? And like I said, I really go off the rails, go into the deep end on this one. So this will do it for this week, but I'm going to pick back up on this the week after next, in the next episode, and talk about the weird stuff that I think maybe could give some context or could have some bearing or be some explanation for kind of what's going on here in Woodside. And, I managed to tie it to all sorts of things like Bigfoot, women in white, etc. So stay tuned for that. That's coming next time. In the meantime, you can check out the show notes with all the sources that I used for this episode at buriedsecretspodcast.com. If you like this, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on your podcatcher of choice, but especially Apple Podcasts. And thanks so much for listening.